US President Donald Trump says an international stabilization force will operate in Gaza soon. Hours later, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel can veto which countries take part. What are the challenges facing such a force and in setting it up? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. An international stabilisation force is one of the elements of the peace agreement aimed at ending Israel's genocide in Gaza. The makeup of the multinational force isn't known, but it's vital to the withdrawal of Israeli troops. On a stopover in Qatar, US President Donald Trump said that it would be in place pretty soon. But less than a day later, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel had the power to veto which countries take part. Meanwhile, the people of Gaza, who have no direct input, are waiting. Their consent will be essential to ensure the force doesn't become to them another occupying power. And the stakes couldn't be higher. The peace deal, driven by Trump and his Arab allies, depends on this step being implemented. So, what are the challenges facing an international stabilization force? What will the US and the countries who've underwritten the Gaza peace deal do if Netanyahu obstructs its progress? We'll discuss all that and more with our guests shortly, but first a report from Alexandra Byers.
The US president says he wants an enduring peace in the Middle East. And at the heart of his 20-point plan for Gaza is the 5,000-strong International Stabilization Force, or ISF, made up of troops from multiple allies, designed to keep the peace as the Israeli army withdraws to predetermined lines. And Donald Trump says they're making progress.
So far, it's just, a period of time. I don't want to give you they're doing it right now. They're actually picking leaders right now. You're going to have peace in the Middle East. This is real peace. It's never happened before. 3,000 years, it's never happened.
The details are still unclear, but it's understood the force will be tasked with providing security in Gaza, overseeing the distribution of aid, ensuring Hamas lays down its weapons, and training a Palestinian police force. The U.S. wants Islamic and Arab states to contribute funds and troops. There's widespread interest, but few have actually committed, with concerns about the potential dangers and the lack of a clear mandate, but also the need for Palestinian support to avoid being another occupying force. So far, Egypt, Azerbaijan, and Indonesia have stepped up. Turkey says it's ready to contribute, but Israel has made it clear it won't accept Turkish troops in Gaza.
Israel will be obviously decide together on who does that. So I have very strong opinions about that. You want to guess what they are?
The U.S. Secretary of State says a team is looking into a possible UN resolution or international agreement, so countries can send their soldiers into Gaza legally.
Obviously, as you put together this force, it'll have to be people that Israel's comfortable, or countries that Israel's comfortable with as well. They need to know what they're signing up for, which is why the work is ongoing to create what is the security force, what is their mandate, what is their command, under what authority are they going to be operating.
200 American troops and a number of British advisors are already working with Israel as part of the Civilian Military Cooperation Center, set up to oversee the ceasefire and Gaza's reconstruction. But questions linger about how effective any stabilization force would be. Peacekeeping missions don't have a great record, with many ultimately failing, lacking the capacity, willingness, and cohesion needed to lay the foundations for a lasting peace. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Doha is Tamer, an Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Tahani Mustafa is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She joins us from London, and from Istanbul we're joined by Mehmet Celik, an editorial coordinator at the daily Sabah newspaper. A warm welcome to you all. Tamer, let's start with you. For something so vitally important, everything seems rather vague at the moment. We don't know when this force is going to be formed, who'll lead it, which countries will be a part of it, what its mission will be. Does anyone know right now, do you think? Will it need a mandate from the UN Security Council? And just how urgent is all of this? Donald Trump says that this force will be set up soon, but how soon is soon? What do you suspect the time frame will be?
Well, Adrian, yes, there are still so many missing details at the macro level, but the big picture is starting to get clearer. What matters is a couple of issues here. From a Palestinian perspective, and as a Palestinian, I think there is this urge to support this force or mission through a UN resolution, because we want it to be aligned to international standards and international law, and the UN has a sole responsibility to keep this mission in checks, under checks and balances, to make sure that it adheres to international law as well, and it's not hijacked by certain forces or agenda. That's number one. Number two, because the entire frame, this 21, the Trump plan to end the war in Gaza and the 21 points in it, it's still missing many details, because it's a gradual, it's a phase-based approach. And I think the mediators are left with the task to resolve many of the details, the important details on the next steps. As we talk now, there are meetings in Cairo with Palestinian factions. The Egyptians are hosting Palestinian factions to discuss the plan with them, and to see where are the bottlenecks, more or less, and try also to mediate between all involved parties. But from a Palestinian perspective also, there are some red lines. Red lines, when I say red lines, expectations and red lines. We expect that this mission has a transitional nature. It's bound to a time frame. And most importantly, it does not marginalize Palestinian rights for self-governance and determination. That's very important. We think of missions like Kosovo, for example, which have ended war and established governance authorities and capacities on the ground. And now Kosovo more or less is becoming an independent sovereign state with its own sensitive or unique sensitivity. And when it comes to acceptance worldwide, it's not recognized, but still it has capable governance capacities on the ground. We also expect from this mission also to really preserve peace. We don't want eruption of war again. And when I say this, also we expect it to act on the borders, not as a buffer zone or a buffer to facilitate Israel's mission of staying in Gaza. So we expect also a full withdrawal from Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip, and this is something I don't think the Palestinians also will compromise at some point. It takes time, but that's an ultimate outcome that Palestinians expect from this force. And thirdly, and most importantly, we expect this mission also to initiate reconstruction, which is pretty much a top priority, because Gaza needs reconstruction efforts. Gazans need to stay in Gazans, and also to establish inclusive governance. And when I say inclusive governance, this goes to a very important and tricky point, because everyone talks about excluding Hamas, but no one has the real details of what does excluding Hamas means. There is Hamas the military, but there is Hamas the movement, and there is Hamas the government. Right. So we talk about a large government apparatus with civil servants, thousands of them. What's their future? What will happen to them? And these are all important questions the mission has to address.
You raise many issues, which I hope we can come back to as part of the discussion here. But Tahani, of course, no one's asked Palestinians how they feel about this force with which they will have to interact on a daily basis. Why haven't they been consulted? How important is the agreement of people in Gaza to the success of the mission? Without it, could this stabilization force become just another occupying force in the eyes of Palestinians?
Well, precisely. You need local buy-in, but that seems to be something that has been deliberately omitted in this case, and that's not necessarily exclusive to just Gaza. I mean, even if we look at the quasi-state building project in the occupied territories throughout the last 3.5 decades. a lot of that came at the exclusion of Palestinians, where a lot of the ideas of what governance should look like, who can represent them, have effectively been imposed. And this 20-point plan does precisely that, whereby you have substantial planning, crunching of numbers, but a lot of this is being done where there isn't a single Palestinian in the room. Even now with the current civilian military coordination center, those effectively advising those on the ground now that are trying to sort of gather what they call the human terrain or human intelligence on like the socio-political geographic terrain of Gaza, planning reconstruction, and even elements of what's needed in the intermediary. There is not a single actual Gazan that is advising them. You have Israelis, you have Palestinians from 48, you have diaspora Palestinians, but you don't actually have any Gazans there effectively advising, which is absolutely bizarre, but also is very indicative of the kind of thinking here, which is, again, something that is effectively going to be imposed on Gazans, unfortunately.
Mehmet, why have so very few nations committed troops to this proposed international stabilization force thus far?
Well, I mean, why I think those who are actually concerned about the Palestinian struggle and the stability, not only in Gaza and the occupied territories, but as a bleeding wound in the region, those who want stability, they want to push forward for that ISF and be part of that. It's something that they think that it will help not only rebuild Gaza and establish stability there and further legitimization of a sovereign Palestinian state, perhaps the stability in the region is something they also look at in the bigger picture. But if I could just comment on your previous question also, just with one sentence. I think the whole 20 plan itself has been a one-sided plan. Now that the mediators and even those states that want to be part of the ISF, they have stepped forward, Israel once again wants to have that colonial mentality and have a one-sided imposing mentality that they're saying we will even limit and we will also decide who can participate in this ISF. Again, there is no Gazans, again, there's no Palestinians, but even the states that want to mediate, and they have been as mediators, or they want to be as part of this agreement as guarantors, Israel is also putting its foot on the ground and saying, I will decide who can actually bring forces in. I mean, this is something that I think it comes from a very deeply rooted perspective of how Israel sees Palestine and Palestinians and the regional stability for them is something that they dictate, something that they decide, something that unless they are okay with, it should be, they see that it will be working. But whereas the international community or even the regional countries, they are willing to not only participate in this ISF, but also in the reconstruction, in the rebuilding of the infrastructure, or even in facilitating the aid, Israel says, I will decide what is happening. If this is not, again, I mean, we're calling this a ceasefire, but the killings have continued. We're calling this a transition plan. But Israel is still dictating. And this is why I think precisely the Gazans think that this is another form of occupation if the Gazans and even those guarantors are not actually included in any of these plans.
Tamer, why should Israel have a veto over the makeup of this force? I mean, you'd perhaps expect Israel to obstruct and to delay the deployment of the force. It's already falling short on the amount of aid that it agreed to allow into Gaza when it signed the ceasefire deal. Now it's insisting, as we heard, that it'll have the final say in the countries that make up the stabilization force. What will the US and the countries who've underwritten the Gaza peace deal do if Netanyahu seeks to obstruct progress?
Well, Adrian, I mean, Israel should not have any veto over this process. I mean, and this is left to the involved countries in this force, in this stabilization force, and also the donors, and mostly Arab donors. We're talking about Arab and Islamic donors who have committed themselves to reconstruct Gaza, they have to make sure that they don't repeat the history of Israel, of having Israel in control of the ins and outs of this process, and in control of of the political and security arrangements in the Gaza Strip, and also when it comes to aid delivery, having access over borders, etc. And I think this time we have been hearing, and we are still hearing, a different tone from these stakeholders, mainly Arab and Islamic countries, who insist that they don't want to see this history re-emerging again, meaning they want to reduce or eliminate or get guarantees from the US that Israel's role will have to be controlled and diminished at some point for these, if I want to call them peace dividends when it comes to reconstruction efforts, to be protected and sustained, because these donor countries, they don't have appetite anymore to finance, again, failed peace processes when it comes to this reconstruction process. So I think it's up to them to use their leverage with the US, which has been showing some different attitude this time. I'm not that pessimistic. We see a very keen and involved US administration. Of course, ideally, it's not going to give what Palestinians expect. But for me, what matters at this point really is just ending this genocidal war and taking care of people's needs on the short and immediate terms. Long term, there are still many big and important issues that have to be sorted, not related to Gaza per se, but to the bigger project, to the West Bank, to the Palestinian statehood project, which has been mentioned but vaguely in the 20 points Trump has listed. So this has to be an inclusive, gradual operation or peace process, if I want to put it this way, that starts from Gaza, because Gaza is the center of the attention, and it requires all attention and priorities now to relieve people's suffering and to enable them to stay on their land. And then slowly it has to look at the entire more complicated issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think if the Arabs this time use their real leverage, political, economic, and they do have it, and they do have Trump, and Trump more or less is fed up from Israel, is fed up from Netanyahu, and he wants to leave a stamp. He wants to have this historical achievement in this region. There is an opportunity, and there are so many vast challenges, but the momentum is there. And again, as I've said, this is a gradual plan. So many details are missing. So it's up to these involved stakeholders this time to make sure that they put their conditions on the table and that Israel is not steering this process by any means.
Tahani, I want to come back to an issue that Tamer raised a few minutes ago, and that's the disarmament of Hamas. What's your view on the immediate future of Hamas? President Trump, of course, says that it will be required to disarm within a reasonable period of time. He said one wonders what constitutes a reasonable period of time, and to what extent is Hamas's continued strength and capabilities, despite 2 years of war, perhaps putting some countries off, that's making them reluctant to commit to this stabilization force?
Well, I think over the last 2 years, there's definitely been a bit of a schism in terms of what the red line has been for Western states and the rest of the world when it comes to Palestinian reconciliation and governance. And Hamas is not the kind of pariah to the rest of the world as it is to Israel's Western allies. But in any case, Hamas have already, with guarantees from regional states and regional mediators like Egypt, made it very clear that they have no intention to govern Gaza. And even now, as we speak, as they're reinforcing law and order in the parts of the Strip that they do control, they're also working with the PA, with Fatah, to come up with names for the technocratic committee to hand over governance, as well as still trying for reconciliation. And over the last 2 years, we've seen that the biggest impediment of any attempts at reconciliation or coming up with some kind of preemptive post-war handover has been more Mahmoud Abbas than it has been Hamas. In terms of disarmament, Hamas themselves have been saying for the last 2 years, in May 2024, its leadership were even quoted by outlets like CNN saying that they were willing to completely disarm. However, that needs to come with guarantees that Israel will act in good faith and guarantees that there will be a serious peace process that leads to a sovereign Palestinian state. Hamas is not married to armed resistance. It is quite flexible, and now I think it's more flexible than it's ever been. And this is really the moment where the world really needs to, or the international community really need to capitalize on that flexibility. Hamas themselves have said, and even the US and Israeli security establishment agree, disarmament a fast, quick disarmament process is not going to work. Even if Hamas were to disarm tomorrow, you're still going to have the issue that there are going to be defectors in the movement that don't agree with the process. And Gaza has a whole host of different radical groups that these elements can join, which just leads to more insecurity for both Gazans and Israel. I think that's another thing that the Israelis deliberately tend to admit, is that Hamas has actually served Israel's security very well for the last 15 years, where it has managed to keep a lot of these radical elements under control in their engagement with Israel. In many ways, I think that has been part of the backlash that Hamas has received from Palestinians, as much as the PA does, in the accusation of being a subcontractor. But in any case, Hamas themselves have said that they're willing to decommission in the interim period before you get to the more substantive issue of total disarmament. But even decommissioning needs to come with guarantees. They've modeled that, or at least they tend to draw parallels with something akin to the Good Friday Agreement in the case of Northern Ireland, where that came with a serious peace process alongside it and international guarantees. And that's something that they still haven't received from either Israel or the US.
Mehmet, on Sunday, Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear once again that he doesn't want Turkey to be part of this stabilization force. Turkey, probably, of course, one of the most competent armed forces for this particular job. What's his objection to Turkey's involvement?
Well, I think, as you said, Turkey is perhaps one of the most, suitable forces, not only because of their military know-how and capability, but also given Turkey's regional influence and Turkey's relationship with not only Hamas, but with the Palestinians as a people. Netanyahu's objection to Turkey is not something that is limited to Gaza. Netanyahu and Israel and Turkey are on two sides of competing rivalry in Syria. And Israel is not happy with Turkey's very strong influence over Syria. But it's something that is also beyond just Syria and Gaza as well. Turkey's growing regional and even international influence is not something that is very settled in Netanyahu's mind. It's constant remarks against Mr. Erdogan comes from the fact that Mr. Erdogan's popularity and growing regional influence militarily, politically, diplomatically, mediating many different conflicts around the world. I think that strength and popularity of Mr. Erdogan is something that bothers Netanyahu very strongly. In addition, I think, given Israel's ultimate aim of, that through that interpretation of a holy text, Turkey sees Netanyahu's aims to ultimately reach to Anatolia. And for that reason, Turkey very strongly rejects expansionist policies of Tel Aviv. And as I said, due to all these different regional and even in the bigger picture, as Turkey sees Israel as a direct threat to its own territory, Netanyahu's not welcoming Erdogan or Turkey to Gaza is something that is not just limited to this ISF.
Tamer, what are we to make of the fact that President Trump met with the Emir of Qatar on Saturday evening when Air Force One stopped in the Qatari capital to refuel on its way to Asia? What were the optics of that meeting intended to signify?
I think it's. With this incident that happened, the assassination of the attempt to assassinate Hamas leaderships and the attack on Qatar's sovereignty, this was a red line that was really crossed by Netanyahu this time, and it created this massive anger and dissatisfaction among key allies to the US, be it Arab countries, GCC countries, and I think the message was very clear. Trump received a very clear message that such attack will jeopardize strategic relationships and partnerships between Qatar and the US, and also the larger GCC and the Arab region. And I think having him stopping here in Qatar and meeting the Emir it's a sign, it's a message of reassurance that this will not happen again, and that this strategic partnership, if you want to put it this way, will stay and maintain strong as is.
Tamer, I'm sorry to cut you short. We're rapidly running out of time. Tahani, to what extent do you think some countries are reluctant to contribute to this stabilization force unless it leads to the end of Israeli occupation and a clear path to Palestinian statehood. We've talked here about Gaza, of course, the people of Gaza. What does it mean for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank?
Look, I think, in terms of other countries' reluctance to really engage in any kind of stabilization force unless the optics change, because right now it appears that they would be coming in off the backs of Israeli tanks and clearly working as subcontractors to some degree in terms of cementing Israel's current occupation. And until that changes, it really puts a lot of these states that have been propositioned for this in a very difficult situation, especially domestically, where already many of these regional states are in quite a precarious situation with their own domestic publics, even well before the 7th of October. But their policy vis-a-vis Israel over the last 2 years with what's happening hasn't really helped things. If anything, it's created a lot more internal destabilization. So there is a lot of sort of careful treading around this right now. And until the optics change, I don't think those positions can really change. What this ultimately means for Palestinians in the West Bank, I think there is unfortunately an incredibly bleak outlook right now amongst Palestinians in the occupied territories more broadly. What we're seeing now in the West Bank is an acceleration of Israeli policies, creeping annexation, increased violence, increased fatalities, where Palestinians, just as Palestinians in Gaza, are really questioning whether they have a future on their land and how long that they'll be able to actually remain on their land. The same issues are propping up in the context of the West Bank, where I think for the majority of Palestinians in the occupied territories, the prospect of statehood or something positive coming out of all of this is really bleak.
And again, Tahani, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Mehmet, we've got about a minute left on the programme. As Alexandra pointed out in her report right at the beginning of the programme, very few peacekeeping missions succeed in terms of their objective. What will it take, do you think, for this one to do so?
Well, I think the buy-in from Palestine, any state that will be putting boots on the ground needs to have, I think, a very strong communication and relationship with the Palestinian cause in general, but also with Hamas and also the Gazan people. If this is not established, if there is no direct relationship between the soldiers on the ground and the Palestinian people, I think it will lead to a more complicated situation.
And there we must end it. Many thanks indeed to you all for being with us. Tamer, Qarmout, Tahani, Mustafa and Mehmet, Celik. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this issue, you can join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story, from me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.